This is Trend Following Radio, where great thinking comes alive. Nobel Prize winners, legendary traders, best-selling authors, and the pros that know what drive us irrational human beings. I am your host, Michael Coveil. Not filtered, raw, honest. That's my passion. My guest today is Michael Muthukrishna. He is a professor of psychology at the London School of Economics. Today we discuss his new book, A Theory of Everyone, the New Science of Who We Are, How We Got Here, and Where We're Going. Now, you probably already feel out there, well, at least some of you will feel out there, that a topic like this has to have some controversy. Okay, it probably does. Maybe some of you think there's no controversy. That's your choice. But if we're going to get into the nitty-gritty, a theory of everyone, how we got here, where we're going, not so easy. Because you see, we're not so similar. Oh yes, we're similar, we're Homo sapiens. But we got all kinds of different needs, desires, wants, intelligences. We're a pretty diverse group. Without any further delay, let's jump right in with my guest today, Michael Muthukrishna, and discuss his theory of everyone. Michael, I don't typically start with such a big question like this, but I think it's smart with this particular content, this episode with you. Such an interesting title for your book. But beyond that, because I don't want my audience to think this is just only book promotion, it's not, but it's a great place to start because this a theory of everyone. I think for us to really have a nice conversation today, which I'm sure we'll probably have some agreement, maybe there'll be some disagreement, but I think you need to probably put down in your best non-jargon way, your best non-LSE way, a theory of everyone. What do you mean by that exactly?
A theory of everyone is a play on the phrase, a theory of everything in physics. So in physics, what that means is it's this grand unifying theory that connects, for example, quantum gravity with general relativity. How do these things connect up? The premise of the book is that that is the point that we have reached in the human and social sciences. So we've reached this point where we have this grand unifying theory that helps make sense of the rest of the world. All the mature sciences have reached this point. Once upon a time, the world was chaotic and confusing, and everything seemed completely disconnected. And you had kind of mini theories or mini explanations for what was going on. As one example, we used to think that Thor was banging his hammer or capricious gods were creating the weather. And then you had folks like Newton and Maxwell and Einstein come along and write down equations, and suddenly, oh, all of these forces are connected to each other. I mean, the weather's still difficult to predict, but we know how it works. Newton himself is trying to turn lead into gold. And that's not because Newton's a dumb guy. He's not. But he doesn't have a periodic table. He doesn't understand that there are elements that fit into particular patterns, and turning lead into gold means turning one element into another, and that makes absolutely no sense. But once we had a periodic table, we could see, oh, so that's why gunpowder works, and that's why when you mix metals with an acid, you can create gases, but actually turning lead into gold makes absolutely no sense. The chemical world is now ordered. Protein folding, still difficult, but we make a lot of progress when we reach that unifying theory. Obviously, the biological world is the most recent of these. So it was very confusing why some animals laid eggs and some had wings and some had live births. And it all seemed like a chaotic, confusing world. And then along comes Darwin and later on, Fisher and Wright and the modern synthesis. And it's still difficult to predict ecologies. It's still difficult to predict exact species trajectories, but we now know how it works. We understand the human animal. We understand its place in evolution. We understand common lineages and divergences and how animals adapt to particular environments and co-evolve with one another and so on. So that's the moment we've reached in the human and social sciences. In the scientific world, this is marching across disciplines. So previously, you've got all of these different disciplines working on different problems. You've got folks in maybe sociology or political science or economics working on, say, corruption. You have psychologists who are working on various aspects of heuristics and biases, let's say. You've got people trying to understand changing values and trends over time. It's a chaotic and confusing world. And what's happening in terms of why we care about female body count more than male body count seems completely disconnected to what's going on in terms of innovation in Silicon Valley, or why sometimes democracies are teetering and other times they're stable.
What did I just not understand about the female versus male body count? What did I miss?
You mean like, why is that in that particular case?
I didn't understand what you were saying. I missed it.
Oh, I'm sorry. There's a new meme going around. The fact that we shame female sexuality far more than we do male sexuality. The current meme or trend on social media is that guys are going after how many guys that a woman has slept with. That's their body count. And people are like, well, why don't we care about that for guys? It's a twist on an old idea.
Oh, okay.
Maybe it's not the best example.
But it's a very interesting point, and maybe we'll bring it up later. But now that you explain it like that, I get what you're talking about. It's a very interesting conversation. I don't necessarily know if there's a clear divide there. There is very clear-cut sides on that. I did not mean to interrupt you.
No, that's okay. The difference is not so much in the number, although there does seem to be some evidence of that too. The difference is in the attitude that many societies have towards that number, men versus women. I don't want to focus on any of these particular things. My point is that we've reached this point where we have a theory of everyone, a theory of human behavior, this understanding that unifies all of this. It all actually fits in and makes sense under like a periodic table for people, a theory of evolution, in this case, a theory of everyone. And so what the book does is in part one is lays that out. If I were to boil it down and say it very simply, I would say a lot of our focus in understanding human psychology has focused on the brain, the hardware. And we now know that humans are the result of millions of years of genetic evolution, a lot of which has happened in our brain, as well as our lifetime of experience. But we have this third piece of information, the second line of inheritance in between those two that we call cultural evolution. So we have not only millions of years of genetic evolution, but also thousands of years of cultural evolution that have adapted to different environments and circumstances around the world. So what that means is that to understand humans and our society, we not only need to think about human hardware and institutions and technology, but also the software that's running on our brains and the way that those are interacting with the institutions that are being created and how it creates those institutions. And we have very nice mathematical models that for the first time are doing a good job of predicting how we assimilate all of that information and how it plays out over time.
We've only got so much time today, just as a caveat, in the sense that the topic that you are throwing out there, you and I both know we could probably carry this conversation on for days.
I was wondering how you're going to
You know this for sure. Today, I'll take you around to many areas and try to get some space out there defined, but we'll never be able to touch on everything. You have picked such a deep dive into the deep end, so to speak. But here's something that did catch my eye, and maybe I'm reading it wrong. Maybe I'm not understanding. And it's a nice chart. I think it's on page 19. It's called the dual inheritance theory. It goes to what you were just saying a second ago. For people that are not seeing this, it shows essentially on the left side, it says genetic inheritance. On the right side, it says cultural inheritance. On the genetic inheritance side, you have things like eye color, skin color, blood type, a hair color type, lactose persistence, some genetic disorders. On the cultural inheritance side, you get social norms, beliefs, traditions, food, mental models, literacy, mathematics, technologies, values on the cultural side. I'm a skeptic, okay? So I'm looking to find holes in your theory of everything right away. That's the only way I operate. I said to myself, on the genetic side, and here, this might be controversial as hell, I don't know, but on the genetic side, I say to myself, where's the statement that talks about height or intelligence? Those seem to be missing, especially intelligence. Is that not viewed in modern science, that intelligence would not come under the genetic component?
You picked two excellent examples of things that are both genetic and also very cultural. So if you take something like height, for example, the Dutch are the tallest people in the world, but they weren't always the tallest people in the world. They've rapidly gone up through the 20th century in height. So the fact that they have changed is obviously cultural. It's too short a time period for that to have been a genetic change in their population. And that's probably to do with their consumption of dairy, their high levels of lactase persistence, the fact that they can take a lot of calories from the dairy, and just higher nutrition rates. On the other hand, we don't know this because there hasn't been a gene identified, but it doesn't seem implausible that there is a genetic component to that. The same thing with intelligence. The question that we are interested in is what explains the differences that we see around the world? So I deal with this in chapter 3. Right up front, I start to talk about this. A lot of our intelligence, I would say most of our intelligence, is to do with our software. So the human brain tripled in size in the last few million years. But since the rise of modern humans, if anything, our brains have shrunk.
Just to clarify, when you say software, the implication being cultural, learning in school.
Yeah, I mean, the kinds of accumulated ways of thinking, metaphors, analogies, entire epistemologies that have evolved over time and are transmitted to us, primarily by school, but also by our societies. So I'll give you an example, something like counting. Humans can clearly count. We seem quite good at it. But at one point in time, as some small scale societies still do today, we counted like this: 1, 2, 3, many. We didn't have a full blown counting system. But even once we did, and it seems to have evolved to do with, for example, trade, keeping track of who owes you what, it still took centuries after that to get to the point where 0 was a number. And that's because our metaphor for counting were body parts like fingers or stones and notches placed with those stones in clay. That limits 0 because 0 stones is 0 of everything. It's very difficult to understand as a number. But then in the 17th, 18th century, we created a number line. So we moved from objects to a new metaphor, movement and position. And suddenly 0 became obvious. Now, prior to that, we had invented the concept of 0, but it was difficult to transmit. Once we had a number line, we could transmit it even to children, and negative numbers, which prior to that were very confusing. Right up until the 17th, 18th century were very confusing, suddenly made a lot more sense. Now it's natural. We don't even think about it. It becomes an instinct to the point where all of us, right? We all live in this giant bubble of other people who are educated. So it's hard to know what is a human universal. And the data doesn't tell you. I'll give you an example of this. Are you familiar with the Stroop test? You might have seen it. Maybe you don't know what it's called, but it's got words for colors like red, blue, green, orange. And the words are either written with an ink in the same color, so red written in red, or in a different color, so red written in blue or red written in green. And your job is to say the color and not the word. And you go through it in sequence. People struggle with that. They can't help but read the word. Instead of saying blue, they'll say red because that's what it says. Reading has become an instinct. Now, in this case, we know the history of reading. We know that literacy wasn't everywhere, and now it is, but it's become an instinct. So if you were a psychologist from Venus and you came down to Earth, you would go, oh, it appears that humans have a genetically innate, hardwired instinct for reading, but not for color perception. And of course, you'd be wrong. Many aspects of our thinking are exactly like this. They are built into our cultural software transmitted to us. If P, then Q reasoning. So we have this wonderful data that builds on this work by Russian psychologist Alexander Luria. So Luria goes out to Uzbekistan, and he wants to study how education is changing the Uzbek people. And so he starts with these if P, then Q reasoning problems. So he says, where it snows, the bears are white. In Novaya Zemlya, it snows. What color are the bears? So he asks people with education, they're like, white. If I ask you, you'd say white. If I asked my 6-year-old, she'd say white. But when he asked people without education, they said things like this: probably brown. I've seen brown bears. I have no idea. I'm not really sure. And he's like, listen carefully. Where it snows, the bears are white. It snows in Nova Zemlya. What color are the bears? They're like, possibly black. Now, to you and I, that's crazy. But it shows that even something like the naturalness of reasoning, it's not that humans are incapable. There is no proclivity toward it. And we think without being taught and enforced and driven to us by education, these very concrete ways. We replicate the same thing in Namibia and Angola with an even cleaner natural experiment than what Luria had.
That seems on the face of it that there are data sets that I can think of that might throw monkey wrenches into that. For example, America loves to have its what I would call racial silo debates when it comes to education and stuff like that, education, IQ, et cetera. Clearly, if you were to look at the data in America, those with East Asian ancestry are scoring the highest. If Harvard did not have some type of bias to assorted racial groups, I think probably Harvard would be 100% East Asian.
Well, I don't think it'd be that high, but because the population size is smaller. But yes, they would be way overrepresented. Absolutely.
So I guess that's the part that when we're talking about this, and we're trying to unpack this on the cultural side, it's like I've spent the last decade living in Vietnam as an American Caucasian living in Asian countries. So I've had this chance to observe what I would call this natural proclivity of just snappiness in terms of the mindset, whether that's man on the street or highly educated PhD or whatnot. It's tough because I think most people would probably, if they look at their kids or they look at their family members, they can see a commonality. There might be some divergences. If it's a large family, there might be the one younger brother who just doesn't get it. He's off to the side. But overall, it does seem like the answer is, as you say, you've got a dual inheritance theory here. It seems like to me, though, that to go down the path to talk about the genetic inheritance side of it really causes a lot of stomach aches in modern society, in modern debate, in modern culture.
Absolutely. Just to be clear, I'm not saying that the genes don't matter. What I'm saying is that the Flynn effect is the rise in IQ test performance over time. And it's stagnated now, but it's been rising about 3 points per decade on average. That is not a genetic effect. Nutrition seems to be mostly ruled out. That is an effect of our societies becoming more complex, education becoming better and more widespread, and even our TV shows becoming more complicated. Think of Wham Bam Batman from the 1960s versus The Dark Knight from the early noughties. These changes over time are cultural changes because, as I said, since modern humans, there haven't been these major changes in genes. Now, that doesn't mean that there aren't genetic differences between people and possibly even groups. And I would also say that there is this reticence to fully exploring this problem. And it's something I talk about in the book. It is free speech. And unfettered scientific exploration is essential to understanding the truth about the world.
That statement right there could get you canceled.
Yeah, I know. I mean, I really took the gloves off in this book. I'm very clear. And I have a paper on this, by the way. What I'm saying is that if in a world in which we all had access, let me ask you a question, just so you can understand what you're reading sometimes when you read about heritability. What would you say the heritability of number of fingers is? The genetic heritability of number of fingers. If you had to guess.
It's going to be probably damn close to 100% for most people. And then there's going to be some variation that something will go wrong in the stew, so to speak, as we're formed. Something will go wrong and somebody will come out, unfortunately, not like the rest of us.
In fact, the genetic heritability of number of fingers is close to 0%. And that is because what heritability actually measures, so when you hear that IQ is 50% heritable or 80% heritable, what it means is how much of the variation in the phenotype, in this case, intelligence or educational attainment or height or whatever you're interested in, is predicted by the variation in genes. So in the case of number of fingers, because there's not a lot of variation in number of fingers or variation in the genes coding for 10 fingers, heritability is actually almost zero. It's a bit off that because some people do have polyheritabilism.
So two smart PhD parents, it's not going to be a surprise the kid's smart.
So that's the difference between heritability and genetic inheritance. So genetic inheritance is real. But what I'm saying is the numbers you get on these things. Here's another example of this. This is an example from the book as well. In the United States, heritability of IQ among wealthy Americans is about 80%. Heritability of IQ among lower SES, poorer Americans is around 10 to 30%. Now, why is that? How could it be that the genetic heritability? The reason for that is because the environment, the cultural input, the resources, the difference between elite school A and elite school B is small. Heritability should be better thought of as an indication of how fair and equal our world is. So in a world where everybody had the same school, the same parental environment, the same access to resources, heritability would be close to 100% because the only thing left to vary is genes.
Let me keep it at the East Asian example for a second. So the whole tiger mom concept. Okay, if I was to look at groups in America, there's a big deviation. For example, Asian groups in America, Caucasian groups in America, Black groups in America. If you put it only on the parent, that just seems tough because ultimately that becomes a political process because ultimately it becomes about money. This group, whatever that group might be, can't do something because we think the parents aren't doing the right job or they're not doing this and that. So therefore, that's the part that starts to feel a little unnerving to me in the theory of everyone, to where it's like, where is the responsibility quotient? Or where's the responsibility there in terms of this process to just always come back to, well, we've compared all the groups and one group didn't have this, but why did the one group not put forth the effort that the other group was putting forth? That's the part that starts to drive me a little bit crazy, is effort.
Some component of it might be individual, but these are cultural phenomena. These are social, their environment, their neighborhoods. So if you take the East Asian example, we have massive selection for some immigrants and not others in the country. If you have massive selection, you are picking the best and brightest. And that is some combination of genes, culture to do with your drive, your ability to sit down and focus, the value you place on education, and so on and so forth. In the book, I've just got it up in front of me, actually. So on page 139, I have this graph of the median household income of different ethnic groups within the United States. And you will see the way that we talk about racial differences in the US and here in the UK as well is gross in the sense of it's broad brush and it doesn't make a lot of sense. So if you look at that chart, you will see different groups with different skin colors and very close origins or whatever with very different household incomes. And that is going to be some function of their access to resources, their culture, the value they place on education, the amount of selection through the immigration process, as well as potentially genetic difference.
As well as their particular effort, too.
Their individual efforts.
Of course.
So, of course, these are group level phenomena. Part one of the book is like laying out this theory of everyone. But actually, a lot of my focus is when you have a periodic table of people, the next thing you can begin to do is applied chemistry. So part two of the book is all about, well, what can we do in terms of policies? If you buy that this theory is correct about humans and we're very good at predicting and whatever, what can we do about this? And so I highlight some of the efforts that are already excellent. So Harvard's project, Opportunity Insight, run by the economist Raj Chetty, is fantastic. So what they look at is when you look at different neighborhoods, you find that if you take a child who otherwise looks identical to another child, but you take them, you help them, for example, with the rental assistance programs that the United States has, and you help them to selectively pick a neighborhood with more opportunities, where there's more interaction between the rich and poor, where there's better schools, there's better support for college applications, and you take them there. The earlier you take them there, the better their lifetime income, the higher chances they go to college, they go to a better college, the higher their scores, and so on. So you can see the hallmark of the United States is this inequality. And that's why heritability is so low among poor Americans. Genetic heritability is so low. It's because there are literal school lotteries that determine outcomes. So the non-genetic portion of explaining people's IQ or educational attainment is massive. Now, if you look at the heritability difference between the rich and poor in lots of Europe or Australia, it's actually flat. There is no difference between the rich and poor. And the reason for that is that the schools are more equal. It looks a lot more like wealthy America, but it's somewhere in between.
Let me bring something up here that we've not really talked about yet. If I look at your subtitle, use the word we 3 times. Here I am not sitting in America, completely cognizant of an entirely different culture than America. And that's an important word, obviously, culture. There's a lot of different cultures on this planet.
Absolutely.
They're not all created equal. And some of those cultures are clearly superior. Is that a controversial thing to say?
The first thing you said is absolutely correct. Here's the thing about the human animal. When most animals encounter a new environment, they're forced to genetically adapt. Bigger muscles to outrun predators, proteins to process the local poisons in the plants, whatever. Humans marched across the globe as hunter-gatherers well before physics, chemistry, biology, before agriculture. And we adapted because of this cultural evolutionary process. So we didn't create new proteins in our bodies. We learned how to cook food, how to process it so that it was edible to us. We didn't get more fat and fur. There's a little bit of that, but mostly we learned how to hunt the local animals and turn their pelts into the warmest of coats. So we did all this culturally. Now, what that meant is that we almost speciated along cultural lines in different populations around the world. We are running very different software on our heads, adapted to our histories in different places around the world. That is a lot of the difference that you're talking about.
But instead of using a word like a lot, because we don't necessarily know the genetic or the culture, we know it's, as you say, there's a dual part going on here. Just to stick with my question for 1 second, is it too controversial to say in 2023, regardless of how we got here? I mean, a lot of people don't care how we got here. We're here. That might sound blunt, might sound not empathetic, but we're here. So in 2023, there are definitely cultures across this planet that are superior. Is that a fair statement? Is that a controversial statement?
I wanted to give you the background to what I was about to say, which is that if you want to pick a particular metric, so if you want to say in terms of productivity, in terms of GDP per capita, in terms of even creativity or something like that, then there are features of different populations around the world, some of which to do with population. So the size of their populations, the interconnectivity, how friendly they are, and all of those features that are higher on those metrics than others. But the moment you say superiority, it's because you're saying some of those outputs are more valuable than others. As a person, I might have opinions about that, but there isn't some objective scale about that. So if you want to say some societies are superior when it comes to productivity, you can say that. And it's true. There are differences in productivity around the world. Americans are more productive than a lot of Europe.
Is an example, and I don't know what percentage of my audience has been there, but for those that have been, you set foot in Tokyo for the first time, and then you set foot in some other place for the first time that is clearly nowhere close to Tokyo, is not headed towards Tokyo, and is not going to be at Tokyo in 1,000 years. That is something that I think people can feel. If I just try to say, well, the metrics alone, well, hold on. Like, we can all see with our eyes, if you start to really get into the nitty gritty and compare cultures. Is that too controversial to say these days?
It's the second half of it that's not just controversial, but probably wrong, because we have seen massive. I have a section in chapter 2 called Civilizations and Barbarians and Primitive People. I don't know if you've read that section. And the point that I make is that over time, different societies, different parts of the world have considered other parts of the world barbarians. We are civilization surrounded by these people who are never going to make it.
Would that have been illogical for some of Western Europe at various points in time in history to think like that? It would not necessarily been illogical, would it?
So Western Europe would have been considered the barbarians during the height of Arabia, or the height of the Indus Valley, or the height of the Yellow River Valley in China. The Romans were considered barbarians by the Greeks. And then eventually the Romans considered all non-Romans barbarians, including the forest-dwelling German tribes, the trouser-wearing French Gauls, and so on. Today, coastal city Americans consider themselves the urban elite compared to the flyover states within the United States. The point, though, in the book is that those differences do change over time. It goes around and around. And the fact that it goes around and around suggests that this isn't some long-standing, we're never going to see any differences. Again, pointing to the book, Eurasia has one advantage, and that is that it has a very large collective brain supported by things like the Silk Road, passing ideas back and forth across this very large landmass, east to west, which is a lot easier to traverse than north-south is, because north-south imposes a lot of climatic differences as you go north and south. So Eurasia has an advantage over Africa and has an advantage over North and South America. Now, when one portion of Eurasia became energy empowered because of cheap and available coal, it created the largest empire the world had ever seen. Now, that happened to be a backwater in terms of Eurasia and in terms of Europe. That was Britain. So I have this quote from Cicero writing to his friend Atticus in 1st century BC, and he says, "There's little to be gained in invading Britain because there isn't a pennyweight of silver in that island, nor any hope of booty except from slaves, among whom I don't suppose you can expect any instructed in literature or music." He's talking about this backwater of the world. That backwater of the world is the ancestor to America. It became the largest empire the world had ever seen.
Let me pause you for 1 second, though. If we keep ourselves at right now, so to speak, we've got pretty defendable borders around the world. These borders for modern nations, they're pretty fixed right now. There doesn't seem to be, except for, as far as I know, I think Ukraine and Russia are fighting over a border for sure, but the borders are pretty tight. China's border is not going to change unless there's a war. America's border is not going to change unless there's a war. When you add the nuclear weapons in the last 50, 60, 70 years, that becomes harder and harder for those borders to change. So it does seem like to me, when I look at the idea of theory of everything, we're starting to have these nations that are fixed. All the progression, the evolution that you're speaking of, going back in time in history to bring us up to where we are now, it's harder and harder to imagine such wild border evolution, such wild cross-cultural evolution. It seems like we're a lot more fixed today. Is that a fair assessment?
Michael, I disagree with that because there's a lot of information flow between nations across the world thanks to the internet. For many of us, we have good passports, passport privilege, and that means borders mean very little. Before I lived in the UK, I was living in America. Before that, I was in Canada. Before that, I was in Australia. It means nothing. I think the Japanese have one of the best passports in the world. It means nothing to move around if you have particular passports.
But Japan is still Japan. It's not overflowing with white guys like me, except visiting.
Not people, but take something like hip hop culture. In Tokyo, you'll find Japanese artists listening and making hip hop music, dressed often like African Americans. There's lots of flow. And we know this from the economic literature too. After Eurasia became energy empowered, we had a great divergence. A big part of the book is the role that excess energy plays in the rise of civilization. And we had this massive takeoff in every metric of progress you might care about after the Industrial Revolution, after the 17th century. As Ian Morris puts it, it makes a mockery of everything that came before: the scientific revolution, the Renaissance, the Black Death, nothing, blips on the chart, on every chart you might look at. And after that, we saw a great convergence as, for example, parts of Asia began to rise. So these areas that didn't have that initial takeoff, thanks to all this energy, began to acquire the technology, began to acquire Western institutions, remix it with their own culture. And eventually you get places like South Korea, Japan, Hong Kong, and now China. In the book, I talk about the role of the shipping container in leading to that rise in trade, for example. But what we're seeing is dynamism, not fixed countries.
Let me keep it at that for a second, though, because I'm keenly aware, as I have to deal with it, I'm keenly aware of America has a nice little passport. But that nice little passport doesn't allow me to live in Japan, China, Vietnam, South Korea, etc. if I just want to be there permanently. We have information flow, but China is still what percentage Chinese? 99.9%. So I guess that what I'm getting at is that you make a really interesting case and you lay out the history of the evolution of how we got to where we're at. I guess the point I was trying to make, though, is the fixed border part, that unless Japan changes its immigration policy, Japan will continue to be mostly Japanese, while Chinese continue to be mostly Chinese. America seems to be one of the few places on the planet that openly says we are going to bring everybody into one place and see how it works.
Yeah, it's not tremendously difficult to get a working visa in these places. Japan has also massively increased their immigration. So I was there a couple of months ago, having not been there for a few years.
If 20 million white guys in America said, I'm tired of relationships in America and I want to go to some place in Japan that's a little more traditional, they're not going to let 20 million white guys move to Japan.
No, they're probably going to have restrictions on that. By the way, America has positive migration from everywhere in the world, I think, except Australia. More people from everywhere else in the world want to move to America than vice versa, except for Australia. As an American, not that many people want to leave. So genes are transmitted vertically, but culture is transmitted horizontally. So we have metrics, for example, for measuring these culture. And take Hong Kong. Hong Kong, on the cultural metrics that we have, is literally halfway culturally between mainland China and Britain, thanks to that 99-year history. The corporations, the culture, the ways of thinking are half British and half Chinese, regardless of the genes of the people, regardless of what they look like. People from around the world can come to a country and they can culturally become part of that country, having been there for long enough, having been born there, or having been there for long enough. If it is truly the software that is driving most of the differences that we're seeing around the world, then the genes are going to play far less of a role than I think you are intuiting.
For example, if I look at my home country, I look at assorted stats for all the controversial topics that no one's allowed to talk about in public, whether that's education to crime, etc. It's hard not to see patterns. I feel like as a guy who sees patterns, if you speak the patterns, the hammer comes down on you.
I'm 100% with you on that. And I think that the reticence to talk about these issues as adults, the reticence to have, as I said, this unfettered free speech and no restrictions on, look, reality is complicated. You could be right. My reading of the literature doesn't match up with yours, but you could very well be right. And the people doing that research, if I were the only voice, the only people allowed in a room, the only polite voices allowed to be in the conversation of those saying it's got to be cultural, then you shouldn't believe those voices because the alternative isn't voiced. And that leaves room for people to go exactly what you're saying. It's like, look, I see these patterns. I also know that we're not in an environment where we can explore all options. So yeah, look, some guy's talking to me about culture. They're saying this, but where's the gene guy? He's not allowed to say it. Maybe he's got a better argument. And the only way we get past that is by having a more adult conversation. I have multiple sections in the book all about the importance of this.
Let me put the controversial question. You cover this in your book. You can lay out your perspective. Feel free. But you talk about climate change. I've not brought this up on this podcast worded like this yet before, but I'm surprised that for those people, there's plenty of people that disagree with you, but for those people that really feel like it's an existential thing, that we really need to get everybody on board right now and work towards climate change solutions. I find it interesting that the folks that have that perspective don't look at their other political perspectives and realize that that causes the other side's skepticism. For example, it's pretty easy if you were to group, let's say, those folks that really want to say climate change is existential. This would be typically a more left-leaning perspective across the globe. When you have that, then you also have, for example, in New York City right now, legally recognizes 31 genders. From my perspective, as a skeptic, I would say, well, why are we only recognizing 31? Let's just give everybody on the planet their own gender, because there's no scientific basis to that. So then you can expand that out to just go to all kinds of issues to where it's all of a sudden, if you are pro, hey, we need to solve climate change, but then that group is also pro, let's make sure Russia loses the war. This cultural morass that we're in, this cultural stew, it doesn't make any sense in the sense that climate change is no longer just something that we can talk about, is something to deal with. It's tied to politics, all of it.
I haven't kept up with the number of genders in New York City, but yeah, I totally agree with you.
They recognize 31 legal genders.
Oh, I'm sorry, 31. When a topic, especially as a scientist, when a topic becomes politicized and polarized, it becomes very difficult to do good work. There's plenty of people who agree with me. There's people who disagree with me, but science doesn't work because each of us changes our minds in the face of good evidence. None of us do, not even scientists. It works because we have accepted standards of evidence and we're incentivized to show other scientists that they're wrong. And that combination leads to slowly arrival of the truth at a population level, not necessarily at an individual level. What you're saying is absolutely correct. I introduced this concept of incentive audits. If you scratch under the surface of most people's beliefs, you will find self-serving incentives. And those self-serving incentives might simply be, as you said, group affiliation. Most of us don't care deeply about things except a handful of things that directly affect our lives. We can instead click like on the things that other people who we care about want us to click like on, change our Facebook pictures. Evolution. Do you believe that evolution is a real thing? Do you support Ukraine versus Russia? All of these things, we don't have enough information. It doesn't affect our everyday lives. It's really just about this, but also other deeper issues. Is it a surprise that if you're wealthier, you're going to support more tax cuts? Or if you're an academic, you're more likely to support a meritocracy? Scratch on the surface, get that incentive audit on someone, and you're absolutely correct.
The academics are supporting meritocracy? I would argue opposite of that.
I would say that on the whole, academics probably do support meritocracy.
It's a really interesting perspective. I can imagine you do. You say it, but it's harder and harder for me when I observe. And I talk to a lot of academics. I guess when the admission policies to universities are not based on merit, it's hard to believe that the teachers believe in merit.
I don't know about the teachers. In recent times, there has come a conflict between the process that led to an academic having a job. There's a joke. You don't believe in the fairness of the system until you're a tenured professor. And then, of course, it was all meritocracy. How else could you have been selected? And again, this is the same idea. Now there's a conflict between the politics around this and about the importance of diversity, I would say, but also in how we achieve it. I have a whole section of the book about diversity is very important. I really took the gloves off, by the way. I'm pretty clear about this.
Hold on. When you say diversity is very important, why don't you outline that for a second, just to be sure I understand?
Sure. So in my research, I talk about what I call the paradox of diversity. And this is the elephant in the room that I don't think people want to deal with normally. You have to grab the bull by both its horns. And that is this. Diversity is, if you buy this idea that innovation is happening at a population level through ideas flowing through our social networks, ideas having sex, as Matt Ridley puts it, then diversity is the fuel for innovation.
Diversity of what? Race, culture, what? Everything?
I'm getting to that. So diversity in ways of thinking, which sometimes map on to things that are surface level. Surface diversity are the kinds of things you're pointing to, skin color, sex, and so on. What we really should care about is deep diversity. Some of that does correlate with your life experience from where you're from, but also the ways of thinking, the discipline you were trained in. There's many ways that we can measure these things. The other side of diversity is that diversity is by definition divisive. If we don't speak the same language, the ideas can't flow through our social network. This would be a very uninteresting podcast if we didn't speak the same language. And other aspects of culture also require some amount of coordination and communication alignment. If we don't have common norms about when I can challenge you, what kind of hierarchy we have, what the standards of evidence are, then we are divided, we are fractured, and ideas can't flow. The way that EDI and diversity is often dealt with is, as I said, this really gross surface level Peter Griffin Family Guy's skin color charts. Oh, we have enough women on this panel to not be embarrassed by it. It's like, well, look, we've gotten enough melanin in the room, so it looks like we're good.
Let me bring something up here, though. So I brought up earlier the idea that there could be superior cultures out there. And clearly, by your reaction, that's not something that necessarily you might agree with or whatnot.
I just want you to put the bounds on superiority. That's all.
To me, sometimes there's a simple heuristic. I land in the middle of Tokyo and it's just like, okay, this is something different. This is superior. And I can compare it to all the places that everyone's been.
This was also the group that was very good at war.
Well, we're currently in a war in Ukraine. So we were in a war in Iraq. We were in a war in Syria. We were in a war in Afghanistan. When you bring up the idea of diversity, can you imagine, though? I can see where that causes conflict because that assumes that each of these diverse groups, diverse ways of thinking that are coming into the room, so to speak, are on equal footing. I don't think there's evidence for that. I think there are superior cultures. I think there are superior ways of thinking, and there are non-superior ways of thinking. And I think if you bring people into the room that are at different levels, however they got to those different levels, and then you say, well, they've all got to listen to each other. They've all got to talk to each other, which is this American thing these days. I don't see how that benefits because the person that got there, however they got there, at that upper echelon, if they're forced to sit there and listen to whatever theory, whatever cultural belief that has been clearly outmoded and is, by the way, the dinosaur, I don't see the benefit there. So I guess that's the part that drives me nuts sometimes.
I hear where you're coming from.
You don't like it.
It depends what you're trying to do. If you are trying to put a person on Mars, you have a room full of engineers, you don't necessarily want disciplinary diversity beyond the disciplines that are relevant to that problem. If you are trying to pick the best employees for a mission critical company or whatever, you don't want diversity in grades from school. You want the best people who did the very best.
We're not doing that these days across corporate America at all. We are completely in a new world.
It is essential. I think it's a terrible thing that we're weakening SATs or GREs and replacing them with far more subjective measures for political reasons. The way we talk about diversity, and the way I think you're thinking about it as well, is this really narrow surface level thing. And you're right, that isn't the kind of diversity that matters. So if you look at something like diversity of experience, holding constant the fact that everyone has similar, good enough grades, if you like, then the best performing teams are diverse, and so are the worst performing teams. And it's because of this paradox of diversity. So what most companies end up going for is more like me. Monoculture is a good and easy strategy. But if you can make that diversity work in the sense that you can get past the communication coordination challenges and you still have good selective mechanisms for relevant aspects of diversity, those are the best performing companies and the best performing teams.
The last big picture issue, which I think is central to bringing people into your world, which is the issue of trust. If there is no trust, then everybody is saying, what's the agenda behind the curtain? As a scientist, and I like to think of myself as a scientist, as a keen observer, I watch what happened to the world 2020, 21, 22. I watch what happened during COVID time, and I see radical disagreement on both sides. I see trust completely different on both sides. And as far as I could tell, every aspect of the scientific method broke down, and we were essentially at mob rules, power rules, listen to us, F you, don't ask a question, be quiet, sit down. And that global effort has done something to trust. It has nothing to do really with COVID. It just has to do with power. But it's done something to trust, especially when we're speaking of science. It's done something to trust that's not very good. And I don't know how we come out of it.
You are absolutely correct. Scientists and public health in particular squandered trust during that period. One of the things I remember the most was masks don't work. Absolutely. Do not wear a mask. And why? Because we need to preserve these for PPE, but we're not going to trust the public. We're not going to treat them with respect. We're just going to tell them it doesn't work. Don't even try to get those N95, N99 masks. If they don't fit perfectly, they're not going to work. And then we moved to everybody's got to wear a mask. You got to wear it. Excuse me, what? What did you just tell me? I thought you said this didn't work. And yes, there was some new evidence that emerged, but people are not stupid. And misinformation is never about information. It is about whom we trust. Because once things became about software, we live in a world where we don't understand, actually. We have what's called the illusion of explanatory depth that makes us feel like we understand most of the world. But most of what we hold in our heads, the things we hold the most, are based on trust of the people that we speak to. I trust that this person is on my team. I trust that this person is not lying to me. And then I'm going to believe it. I'm going to brush my teeth twice a day because I trust that my dentist isn't just trying to make money off me, but actually knows something about this. I'm going to take those vaccines because I trust that my doctor cares about my health and not about lining their pockets.
The same doctors that were prescribing OxyContin not too long ago.
That's exactly what I'm saying. So when that trust gets broken down, as it has been, in science too, by the way, when we live in a scientific environment where the politics gets in the way of our best attempt at unbiased science, none of us is completely unbiased, but our best attempt at that, when questions can't be asked and hypotheses can't be explored, if you cannot trust scientists, how can you trust science?
When you bring up the idea of masks too, I find it so sad across the planet, and this is just my observation, I think I'm accurate here, that the fear that was instilled with the mask usage, for some people, I'm not sure they're ever going to get past it. And unfortunately, my observation is that we scared women a lot more. And I think across the planet, women are still scared. Women, perhaps thin, young women that really never had any of the risks that some of the people with 10 comorbidities and obese, et cetera, had. So I find it frustrating and sad that some of these nice people who trusted the system, and here they are 4 years later, still wearing a mask outside with no risks. And then you start to wonder, well, gosh, and I've seen some articles recently, is there a risk to wearing the damn mask all the time? So it's just so sad what's happened. And some of these people are just really good people, just trying to do the right thing. They don't want to die. They're trusting the system. And then here we are after all these years later, and we've completely, as you talk about in your work, we've created this evolutionary direction, it seems like, where some people have decided they've evolved to permanent mask wearers.
I'm less worried about those who continue to trust the system insofar as, on average, the system is giving you signal and not noise. And it's not, right, in many times. But I'm more worried about those who have completely lost trust in the system and are no longer, for example, vaccinating their children.
Hold on, COVID vaccinations, you mean?
No, just generally, the standard childhood vaccines.
I'm not saying I support that.
You can understand why people feel that way.
Exactly.
Because of the way things were handled and the loss of trust that created, there is going to be an additional death toll in the coming decades that has nothing to do with...
Here's the thing, too. Wouldn't it be completely logical for some people to say, well, hold on, it looks like the COVID vax was not the same type of vax that my kids were taking for all these years. This was some other type of therapy that was kind of ebb and flow, and you'd have to get a booster all the time. Would it be illogical for those same people? Unfortunately, the ladies wearing the masks, they're concerned. And then the vax people are concerned. But wouldn't somebody just sitting back and saying, well, gosh, if they pulled the wool over my eyes with the COVID vax, how do I know they didn't pull the wool over my eyes with the other vax?
That's what I'm saying. I'm not saying they're right about that, because a lot of those vaccines have a lot of evidence behind them and so on. But that is the issue here. And it's not just that. It's when I go to the doctor and I'm working with someone who is trustworthy and I'm getting a diagnosis and I'm getting a treatment plan. But because of that lack of trust, I'm not going to follow that anymore. I'm going to pick the alternative health person or whatever.
Yeah, it's a mess.
That's the death toll that we're going to face in the coming decades. And it was caused by a squandering of scientific trust and a squandering of trust in our institution.
Once we got a handle on this by mid-2020, it was absolutely amazing that we did not have the cojones, scientists, leaders, politicians, etc., to come out and say, hey, now listen, we don't know exactly what the vax is going to do. We don't know what the masks are going to exactly do, but we definitely know this is affecting people who are morbidly obese, who have multiple comorbidities. And I just find it's pure politics that we didn't do that. And what's interesting about the pure politics that we didn't do it is I don't necessarily know that in America, for example, which was scare ground zero number one, I don't necessarily know that morbidly obese differences between the left and the right. Maybe it's split down the middle. So it was just very strange. If we were going to scare anybody about anything, we should have scared people about being overweight, and we didn't do that.
Regardless of the specific, it comes from a place of not treating the public with respect. It was, you can't handle this, so I'm going to tell you what to think. And if you're not going to do it, I'm going to scare you into thinking the way I want you to think.
Yeah, exactly.
Whatever it takes, I'm going to change your behavior. And it was short-term thinking. It has this, as I said, a long-term cost. And I got to tell you, in the book, hopefully what I'm saying in this conversation hints at it, I do treat my readers with respect. You don't have to believe any of the claims about a theory of everyone, its implications, policies, and so on, because of some study. In a world where, especially my field, behavioral science, I barely trust a lot of the literature. With high-profile fraud cases, you shouldn't trust something because a study said so. What I'm hoping readers come away with is like, oh, this makes sense. I can test this against my own experience. I can test this and I can apply it. I have a model for human behavior in the way that once you see the periodic table, once you see it, you can't unsee it. Once it becomes obvious to you the way the world is actually working, it will completely change the way you interact with it and what you think is possible for our collective future.
Michael, cool stuff. Like I said at the beginning, we could go on forever. Where can we send people? The book, A Theory of Everyone, who we are, how we got here, and where we're going. Michael, where can we send people? Where's the best website to find you?
atheoryofeveryone.com should take you to pre-order links localized to wherever you are. But if you just Google it, you'll find plenty of places to pre-order.
Michael, appreciate it. Keep me posted on future books.
All right. Thank you very much for having me, Michael. I enjoyed the conversation.
I see a time when those awake will understand how to make money in up, down, and surprise markets. Whether new trader or experienced, college student or financial advisor, protecting against a crash or just trying to make a lot of money, trend following offers everyone an answer in uncertain times. To get started immediately, send me an email, michael@covel.com. I will send you the right trend following steps to take along with my free video. But if you want to buy and hold, trust the government and trust Wall Street, this is absolutely not for you.